everyone. Welcome to Thanks for Sharing. I'm your host, Jackie Pack. And in today's podcast, I'll be diving into what I think is an interesting topic that lies at the heart of our personal growth and healthy relationships, the concept of differentiation. In this episode, we'll get into the complexity and the depth of differentiation. And I'll also briefly talk about false differentiation. This episode will be divided into two separate episodes. One, I will continue talking about false differentiation on my Patreon channel for my Patreon members, while also wrapping it up for you listening on the regular podcast. What we're talking about when we talk about differentiation is the process of becoming your own person while staying connected to the people that you care about. We'll explore in this episode why individuation, which is the ability to develop your individual self, is so important for our mental health and our psychological well-being. And we'll also look at how our sense of self even ties into our moral development. In particular, I want to discuss psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg's famous stages of moral development, as well as a twist in his story when one of his students, Carol Gilligan, challenged his theory. I think this was an interesting real life example of the process of differentiation. It's a story about how we balance our own needs and values with the responsibilities and the love that we feel for others. And at the end, I'll discuss practical ways you can start differentiating yourself. Or in other words, how you start the process of belonging to yourself, how to stand on your own 2 feet, as well as how to belong to others, the caring relationships that you're part of without losing who you are. So let's get started with the basics. What is differentiation? As I said, differentiation is the ability to be your own person while still maintaining connection with others. Family therapist Murray Bowen pioneered this concept, and he defined self-differentiation as setting apart of oneself as distinct from others. It's the ability to recognize your own thoughts and your own feelings and to respect that they might differ from those of the people around you. He said that a well-differentiated person is confident and comfortable being themselves, even when their close friends or family members disagree with how they see their world. And why does this matter? Well, if you've ever felt lost in a relationship or found yourself saying yes to things in order to please others, even if internally you're saying no, then you've experienced the challenge of being poorly differentiated. People with low differentiation often either merge with others, go along with whatever others want, kind of that go along to get along, or they swing to the opposite extreme and they push others away in order to avoid being influenced or made to feel bad about their own opinions or perspectives. They might change their opinions quickly to get approval or try to dominate and control the conversation and what others are thinking. Both extremes are a sign that this person isn't truly acting from their own secure, steady, stable, authentic self. For a person who is poorly self-differentiated, they may also run to others to accommodate them at the expense of their own happiness, which can lead to resentment, anxiety, and a sense that your life really isn't your own. Another way of looking at poor self-differentiation, as I talked about, is somebody who is so steeped in their beliefs and their opinions that they can't even hear the beliefs or opinions of those they supposedly love and care about because they see that as a threat to who they are. But on the flip side, having strong self-differentiation means that you can maintain your individuality without cutting off your relationships. You can say no when you need to without feeling guilt or feeling rejection. Bowen noted that a well-differentiated individual can stay calm and clear-headed in the face of conflict or criticism, instead of instantly reacting emotionally or surrendering their viewpoint. Instead, you're able to reflect and act based on your values, your principles, and your genuine beliefs. You won't disown your values just to keep the peace, but you also won't reflexively fight or rebel in order to assert your independence and your individuation. This balanced mindset of I am me and I'm also connected with you is healthy for both personal well-being and relationships. In fact, there is research that says highly enmeshed families where nobody is really allowed to be different tend to have a lot more anxiety and turmoil in the members of the family. Whereas families that encourage individual voices often adapt to stress more smoothly. So when I'm explaining this to clients, when I'm explaining the concept of differentiation to clients, I'll usually say, we have these two needs. I mean, we have a lot more needs than just two, but two of our needs are this need to belong to the self and the need to belong to other. And whatever that other is, right? It can be our family of origin. It may be our partner. It can be our group of friends. It could be a religious organization. It can be, the other can be all of these things. And if belonging to yourself and belonging to other is an alignment, then we don't typically have a problem. What the problems arise when belonging to the self starts to contradict or cause conflict in belonging to the other. We will feel cognitive dissonance, and we can use confirmation bias to come in and decide, okay, well, here's what I was taught, and I was taught to be agreeable, or I was taught to not make others uncomfortable. And so I will manage this cognitive dissonance by doing, what has been confirmed to me. So go along to get along, or cause a big blow up and leave that group. Leave that person, sever the relationship. Now, obviously, when we're small, the need to belong to other is pretty important for our survival. And so while we may initially prioritize, this isn't necessarily a thought process, but there might be a priority on belonging to other, meaning mom, dad, family, whatever that looks like, we will prioritize belonging to the other. And at some point, sometimes with the permission of parents, the process of individuation starts to surface. We need to start to develop this sense of self that may be influenced by the messages that we got, or might start to contradict with the messages that we got. Having raised 4 kids into adulthood, I would say, I think the process of individuation starts as a teen. And we see this in a lot of different ways where teens are wanting to start that process of belonging to self. But they're not entirely able to fully differentiate. And that's okay. There's not a rush to finish this process of differentiation. I think this process is a continually evolving one as we have different experiences and are exposed to different thoughts and processes. We may be updating who we are as a person and the people that we belong to. Sometimes when I think about teens, I think of my youngest daughter, who I have often said to her, she was born early. She was born about 4.5 weeks early, and spent the first 2 weeks of her life in the NICU. She had some type of infection when she was born. I don't know that I ever found out what. I know that they ran a full tox screen on me to see if I had been doing any drugs. They did tell me that she acted like a drug baby going through withdrawals, which I had not done any drugs. And apparently the tox screen showed that because nothing else happened after that. I've told her that story since she was young, and how, she came into this world having to fight, even to stay alive. And she's been I would say who she is that has been shaped by that early fight in her life. And she can be the fighter. She can be the um, feisty girl who will speak up and say what she's thinking. She doesn't hesitate to say it, even if it goes against what she knows other people might be thinking. And so I've told her a lot. I know you were born as a fighter and you didn't have a choice. You had to fight. But you also don't have to attend every fight that you're invited to. And part of your challenge in life will be to figure out which battles are worth taking on and which battles you just let it go by and you're no worse for wear. She's 22 now, so she's still in that process of figuring that out. When she was in high school and her friend had moved in, I think this was after her friend had moved in. So they were going to go on a hike up in the mountains. And it was probably in the fall, but it was maybe 5:30 at night that they wanted to head out. Could have been 6 o'clock at night. They wanted to head out. And it's going to start getting dark. And my husband, her dad was like, well, I don't know if that's a great idea to be heading out in the mountains when it's dark. You have a flashlight. He got him a flashlight. But he was also saying, I don't think this is a very good idea. And she turned to the two of us and said, well, we have this flashlight. Lillian has her mace and I have my attitude. So I think we're going to be just fine. And I laugh about that still, thinking of her, because especially when she was in high school, I would say that was the pinnacle of her attitude. And I said to her, yeah, you're right. Your attitude might keep you safe in this situation. Whoever tries to kidnap you would bring you right back to our front door and be like, here, she's yours. So I just don't know that teens are fully able to complete that process of differentiation. I think it even expands in our 20s. Coming into our 30s, I think hopefully we have a better sense of who we are, because we've had some experiences as an adult in this world that shapes and impacts us. And these things are happening outside of our home or outside of family of origin. So let's talk now about the concept of individuation, which is closely related to differentiation. Individuation is essentially the developmental journey of becoming an individual. With this goes developing your own identity, your values, your life path, separate from the identities that were imposed by your parents or your peers or society or various organizations. The famous psychologist Carl Jung described individuation as the process of self-realization, discovering one's meaning and purpose in life, and becoming who one really is. He said that this is a lifelong journey of integrating all the parts of yourself and ultimately fulfilling your unique potential. In the context of family and society, individuation often means that as we grow, especially in the years of adolescence and young adulthood, we start to figure out what we truly think and what we truly want, which may or may not align with what our family or our culture expects. This can be a tricky process. It's not about simply rebelling, although this is a time period in which, depending on how parents are responding to this developmental need for individuation, it can lead to extreme rebellion. It can lead to extreme rebellion. However, individuation itself is not rebellion for its own sake, just to rebel. Instead, it's about honestly coming into your own. Healthy individuation results in a person who can stand on their own principles and pursue their own goals while still maintaining respect, love, and connection with others. These two terms, differentiation and individuation, often go together. Individuation being the process of coming into your own, being your own person and belonging to you. Differentiation meaning exploring the differences between you and the other. If pursued in healthy, adaptive ways, this person wouldn't be isolated or selfish, but they would develop a solid sense of self that can't just be swept away by the currents of other people's opinion or their needs or the group that you might belong with. Instead, it's finding that sweet spot between connection and autonomy. And interestingly, as we'll see, that balance shows up even in how we develop morally and ethically as human beings. One of the examples I will use when I'm talking about differentiation and the ability to belong to the self and the ability to belong to others. And what happens when the others and what they want contradict with who I am and what I want. In this example, it's not an extreme thing, although this process can get extreme, and I'll talk about that towards the end of the podcast. But I'll use this example of when I was a parent and had young kids. One of my values at that time, I don't know that it has shifted, but I feel like we are also reaping the benefits of those values early on. So one of those values that I had is that it was important to me to spend time together as a family, making positive memories. So when we're looking at that ability to belong to the self and to belong to others, as a mom, I am who I am. But I also belong to my children. I also belong, not in some patriarchal way, but I also belong to my husband. We've chosen to build this life together, to be with each other. And we're part of this family unit, and we claim each other as a family. So when the kids were young and we were looking at things to do as a family, whether that was on a holiday when they were off school, like Labor Day or Memorial Day, something like that, not a huge holiday. So when we were looking at different things to do on those days off, we wanted to spend time together as a family. And if a new SpongeBob movie had been released, my kids wanted to go, usually they would opt to go see the SpongeBob movies. Going to a SpongeBob movie was not on my list of things that me as a person would choose to do. So so who I am as a person contradicts with what the group wants to do. The group wants to go see a SpongeBob movie. And as a mom, that's not something I was envisioning doing. That wasn't on my list of things that I had thought about what we could do to spend time together on that day. So how did I reconcile that conflict? Well, for me, and I'm the parent, this might be different if it was me and my siblings, but that would put me in younger years when I was growing up. So me as the parent, one of my values and my guiding principles was doing things together that led to positive family memories. That could include a whole list of things that I was not the only one who got a say in what that looked like. And if the kids wanted to go to the SpongeBob movie, I can reconcile that by saying, I want to do fun things as a family that leads to positive memories. And I'll tell you, my kids thoroughly enjoyed each and every SpongeBob movie and still do to this day. If we're on a road trip, they can pull out the campfire song and sing it. Most of the songs from the SpongeBob movies, they know by heart. They can even get me to sing along with some of the words because I've seen most of the SpongeBob movies, not just once, but more than once. If you've listened to the podcast, however, you also know that there have been groups that I belong to, that I was born into, that I found actually it's time for me to part ways. This is no longer serving me. And it's no longer aligning enough with who I am as a person. And so it's time for me to exit and find something different that is more aligned with who I had become. So now that we have the concept of being an individual and differentiating yourself, being distinct from others in a way that reinforces in positive ways your autonomy, let's start looking at how individuals develop a moral compass. Lawrence Kohlberg was a psychologist in the mid 20th century, around the 1950s. And he was fascinated by how people, especially children, develop their sense of right and wrong. He devised a theory of moral development that had 6 stages. And they were grouped into 3 levels, which he saw as this universal progression. It was an extension of earlier work by Jean Piaget and his concept of children's moral reasoning. In his study, Kohlberg would present people with a moral dilemma. The most famous is called the Heinz dilemma, where a man must decide whether to steal a life-saving drug that he can't afford for his dying wife, and then analyze why they thought the action would either be right or wrong. And it was their reasoning of the person that Kohlberg was interested in. He was looking at their reasoning and would determine their stage of moral development, not just their answer of yes, I would do it or no, I wouldn't. He wanted to know what their reasoning was. So let's go through these levels, these 3 levels of Kohlberg's moral stages. And you'll see how they parallel the idea of growing from being very dependent on others' rules to having your own individuation, your own independence, and your own moral principles. In level 1, he called it pre-conventional morality. This is the most basic level, usually seen in young children, though he acknowledged that adults under pressure can flip into this level as well. In this level, moral reasoning is all about the self. In stage 1, a child thinks in terms of punishment and obedience. If an action would get punished, it's wrong. If you can get away with it or you get a reward for it, it might be okay. Now, this is a very egocentric, consequence-driven view. Stealing is bad because you'll get in trouble and you might get punished, or stealing might be okay if you don't get caught and you end up getting what you want. Stage 2, this is the same level, so level 1, stage 2, is a bit more advanced than this, but it's still self-interested. The child starts to understand reciprocity. That you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. So they might say Heinz should steal the drug because his wife would be grateful and maybe she would do something nice in return. Or on the other hand, he shouldn't steal it because he might get hurt or he might get punished, and then he's not there to take care of his wife. So in both cases, the focus is what's in it for me? How does it impact me? The moral reasoning here avoids punishment and it starts to seek out personal benefit. It's not bad per se, it's just how young minds start to operate, which is that they're centered on their own needs. So now let's move to level 2, which he called conventional morality. So we have pre-conventional, level 1. Level 2 is conventional. With conventional morality, as children grow, often into the adolescent years, they typically move into conventional moral reasoning. Here, the focus shifts from the self to social relationships and rules. Stage 3 is sometimes called the good boy, good girl orientation. In other words, the right thing to do is what makes you look like a good person in others' eyes. Here, approval becomes more important. For example, someone at stage 3 might say, Heinz should steal the drug because a good husband would do anything for his wife, and people would admire him for that. On the other hand, they might say he shouldn't steal because then everyone is going to think he's a criminal and they're not going to like him anymore. So again, there's that shift to what others think of this person, what others think of Heinz. It's still somewhat black or white, and it's about living up to what others expect of you or how they would view you in a way where you're maintaining good relationships and social approval. Stage 4, still on level 2, goes one step broader. So stage 4 starts to include law and order, maintaining social order for its own sake. A person at stage 4 believes in obeying rules and fulfilling their duties and upholding authority because that's important for society to function and for people to live in communities together. They might say, no, Heinz must not steal because it's against the law, and society can't function if everybody breaks the law. On the other hand, they might say, yes, well, he can steal the drug because it's a life-saving drug and saving a life is a duty. But then he should accept the legal consequences because the laws are also important. In either case, the reasoning is about duty, about the rules, and it's about others' expectations. According to Kohlberg, many people stop developing at conventional level. And this is where he said that society operates, following the laws and norms that we've been taught, which would ensure social harmony. Level 3 goes beyond this into what's called post-conventional morality. And this is the highest level in Kohlberg's model, which he found relatively few people reach. At this level, moral reasoning is based on abstract principles that go beyond specific social rules. Stage 5 is sometimes called the social contract orientation. People at this stage recognize that laws are created for the greater good, but also laws are not absolute. They are agreements we make, and unjust laws or situations might warrant breaking or bending the rule. The person considers society's welfare and basic rights. So, for example, a stage 5 thinker might argue, yes, Heinz should steal the drug because the right to life outweighs the property rights of the pharmacist he's stealing it from. They would see laws as social contracts meant to serve human values, and that saving a life is a higher value than the pharmacist making a profit. Or they might reason about changing the law, perhaps making medication more affordable. If you look at American history, we have a lot of people that are known to us from history who rose to the post-conventional morality and started looking at the way society was structured, the way that the rules or the laws were written, and started saying, hey, this isn't fair. This privileges some over others, and that's not in alignment with how things should be or how society operates at its best. But I will say, when Kohlberg was developing this theory, this is the 1950s, you think of 1950s America, this is before the civil rights era. This is before people started protesting involvement in the Vietnam War, and people started questioning if their government was being honest and transparent about what was happening in Vietnam. And it was before we had a president who broke the law to try to win an election. So this level is moral reasoning of a principled civil rights leader or Gandhi. At stage 6, one might say stealing is technically wrong, but Heinz must follow his conscience and the principle that life is sacred if he truly believes saving his wife's life is the highest moral duty. Then that principle justifies his actions regardless of what the law says. In Kohlberg's research, an example of stage 6 reasoning was someone saying that Heinz should steal the drug because protecting a human life is a more fundamental moral obligation than respecting property rights. At this level, a person has their own well thought out ethical compass. They know what their values are. They know their guiding principles. And they're willing to stand alone and go against unjust norms for the sake of what they believe is right and moral. Kohlberg did believe that these stages unfolded in order. So you build each new level of thinking upon the previous one. And as I said, he also found that many people never reach the post-conventional level, and they remain at the conventional level following peer expectations and laws. And he said that's not necessarily terrible because society does need law-abiding cooperative citizens. Kohlberg did see the higher stages as a kind of moral ideal of autonomy and justice. Essentially, a differentiated moral self who can independently reason about ethical principles beyond because that's what everyone else thinks or because that's what the law says. So there's a clear parallel here with differentiation. The highest moral development involves independent principled thinking, not merely going along with the crowd or authority. In fact, Kohlberg's stage 6 is all about an individual's conscience taking precedence over social pressure. However, his theory, groundbreaking as it was at the time, had some blind spots. And this is where his student and understudy, Carol Gilligan, enters the story with a different perspective that will lead us back to the same theme of balancing the self and others in a new way. So let me tell you about who Carol Gilligan was. Carol Gilligan was a research assistant, and she was a collaborator of Kohlberg's in the late 1960s. As she worked with him and learned about his stage theory, she noticed something intriguing. When girls and women were evaluated using Kohlberg's framework, again, remember he thought that his theory was universal across cultures, across genders, across socioeconomic status. But when she evaluated his framework with girls and women, they often appeared to lag in moral development compared to boys and men. Specifically in Kohlberg's studies, both males and females commonly ended up in the conventional level, but girls' reasoning often got classified at stage 3, the interpersonal relationships and the approval of others, whereas boys more often reach stage 4, which is the law and order stage. If we just look at this at face value, it would look like females on average didn't develop as far morally, which is a rather problematic conclusion. And so good thing Carol Gilligan came along, and she did what a good critical thinking female would do. She questioned this finding. She pointed out this important fact that Kohlberg's research was based entirely on male participants, mostly young males, largely from Western cultures. But he was saying it goes across countries, it's universal. His moral dilemmas and his scoring system might have been unintentionally biased towards the ways of reasoning that were more common to those groups. And this is where they had a problem in their relationship, which to me is a little ironic. It's a twist that we didn't see coming. In 1982, Gilligan published a landmark book titled In a Different Voice, arguing that women have been speaking with a different moral voice Kohlberg's theory failed to hear. She wasn't saying that women are less moral. Instead, she proposed that women often prioritize an ethics of care, focusing on relationships, empathy, and context. Whereas Kohlberg's framework emphasized an ethics of justice, which focused on abstract rules and fairness applied universally. So in simple terms, Gilligan observed that many women, and it also turns out that plenty of men too, which is a good thing, tend to approach moral dilemmas by asking, how can I resolve this in a way that no one is hurt and the relationships are maintained? Kohlberg's higher stage approach asks, what is the fairest, most principled rule or choice, regardless of specific relationships? And these are two different lenses to look at something through. Care versus justice. Kohlberg's scoring system valued the justice lens. So naturally, those who spoke in terms of care and responsibility for others which was often women, didn't score as high in their moral reasoning. And Gilligan essentially called out that bias, and she expanded the view of moral development. Her own research involved interviewing girls and women about real-life dilemmas. Famously, she interviewed women considering abortions, which is an issue that's deeply personal now, and it was then, and it's also care-laden. From these interviews, she formulated her alternative model of moral development for the care perspective. Interestingly, she described it not so much as strict stages tied to ages, but as 3 general levels or positions of moral understanding that women, and again, by extension, anyone with this caring orientation might process through. So position 1, she said, was a survival orientation. And that was all about self-care. At this initial level, a person is mainly concerned with their own personal needs and survival. This does sound a lot like Kohlberg's pre-conventional stage, where morality here is essentially, I need to take care of myself first. But Gilligan noted that in some situations, this was not just childish, selfish. It could be necessary. For example, someone who's been victimized or needs to speak up for themselves after being mistreated. Overall, staying in this mode would mean that you're not considering other people's needs much at all in your moral decisions, which would be unbalanced. Her second position was conventional care or self-sacrifice. She said a person might internalize society's message that being good means putting others first. At this level, morality is about caring for others and being responsible, even if it means neglecting yourself, your wants, your needs, your preference. Your identity gets tied to being unselfish, that you're praised for that. For example, someone might think, I should be a good wife or mother or friend and sacrifice my own wants to take care of everyone else. And if I don't, I'm a bad person. This is somewhat reminiscent of Kohlberg's stage 3 in a way that being good by other standards is taken to this extreme of self-sacrifice. Now, again, going back to my example of seeing all the SpongeBob movies, I would say at that time in my life, me reconciling that, not like it took, days or weeks or anything, but it was not driven by social conditioning that I had to give into the whims of others, the needs of others, the preferences of others over myself. At that time, I could reason, I want to do things that create positive memories. And if this is what they choose to do, sure, positive memories can be made from that, which also satisfied my value and my need. Carol Gilligan wrote, many women are socialized into this outlook that our highest potential is always caring for others, even at our own expense. While caring for others is virtuous, Gilligan saw a problem if it entirely overrides self-care. She noted that constantly denying your own needs is not sustainable and can lead to burnout and resentment. Goodness, instead, for her, is equated with selflessness in pleasing others. So in this position, goodness is equated with selflessness and pleasing others or taking care of others. But she did note that it can become one-sided. The most mature level in Gilligan's model is position 3, which is finding a balance between caring for others and caring for oneself. In this position, the person realizes that their own needs and the needs of others are both important. The moral challenge becomes integrating these so that no one is ignored, including yourself. Gilligan sometimes called this the morality of nonviolence, meaning it's not harming others and it's not harming you. In this balanced stance, someone would say, my well-being matters and so does yours. So let's look for the solution that respects both. The moral The morally good choice in this position is one that takes account of everyone, including you. Not everyone except you. And this was a profound shift from position 2. It's no longer considered selfish to honor your own needs. Instead, it's recognized as part of the moral equation. So, for example, a woman at this stage, when faced with a dilemma, like an unfair relationship expectation, she might seek a compromise, or she might speak her truth rather than quietly sacrificing and silencing herself and telling herself that's her role. She understands that honesty and care go hand in hand, that you can be true to yourself and also be kind to others. But that requires you to be open and honest about your needs and about what you want. In Gilligan's studies, reaching this balance often involved a sort of awakening, realizing, particularly for women that she was studying, that self-sacrifice is not the only path to goodness, and that truth and care include caring for oneself. As you can imagine, Gilligan's ideas at the time were revolutionary because they validated a perspective that had been for so long undervalued. She basically said, hey, there's more than one highest stage of morality, which would have been the one just focused on justice. There's also one focused on care. And importantly, she argued that women don't stop their development at a lower moral stage, but instead they might be following a completely different track based on their socialization. Over time, research investigating this Kohlberg-Gilligan controversy found that indeed men and women both are capable of justice and care reasoning. On average, men might speak more in the justice voice and women in the care voice, but these differences were not absolute. And they had a lot to do with socialized messaging. Studies showed that when given ethical dilemmas, men tended to favor impartial principles, while women more often considered personal relationships in context. Both genders understand both approaches. It's just that each was less comfortable using the other's approach. So Gilligan's contribution helped broaden psychology's view that moral maturity can mean different things. It doesn't always look like standing alone fighting for justice. Sometimes it looks like caring and connection and finding compassionate solutions. For this episode and the discussion in this episode, I think what's really interesting is how Gilligan's highest level, which was the integrated caring, echoes the concept of differentiation. It's literally about balancing self and others. Instead of losing yourself in others, which would be position 2, or ignoring others, which is position 1, the mature individual finds a way to honor both. And this is the epitome of what we strive for in healthy relationships. Neither selfishness nor total self-sacrifice, but instead a mutual and respectful balance. In a sense, Kohlberg and Gilligan's theories both ended up valuing a person who can make moral choices based on their own values, their own voice, or their own guiding principles, while also holding concern for the benefit or the welfare of others. They just emphasize different aspects. A Kohlberg stage 6 person follows universal ethical principles, which is the individuated conscience. And Gilligan's integrated care person seeks a solution that's good for both self and others, which is an individuated sense of care. In real life, we need both justice and caring orientations to be truly moral people with principles that guide us. I think it's worth noting that differentiation doesn't mean a lack of care or a lack of morality. In fact, just the opposite. A well-differentiated person can choose to be compassionate and cooperative out of a genuine principle, or out of love rather than guilt and blind conformity. For example, you might volunteer your time to help others or make sacrifices for your family. If you're doing it with a clear sense of choice and principle, that's very different from doing it just because you can't say no. Sure, one can act selflessly, but acting in the best interest of the group actually is a thoughtful choice. It's not just a response to relationship pressures. And this is differentiation in action. The freedom to care for others without losing yourself. Gilligan's break with Kohlberg, which is sometimes dramatized as a split between mentor and understudy, symbolizes a broader theme, which is the importance of including multiple perspectives. And I might say multiple genders in your study and research, but also the courage to voice a truth that goes against the established groupthink. Gilligan respected Kohlberg, but she disagreed, and she individuated her own theory, which is an example of healthy differentiation. Imagine had she followed some socialized message that she had received that said, you can't be right. Don't speak up. Don't disrupt what's happening here. You probably are wrong. Their debate instead enriched our understanding of moral psychology, showing that independence and interdependence both play roles in how we decide what's right. Okay, that's a lot of theory that I gave you. So let's bring it back to you. How do you begin to develop greater differentiation in your own life? Or in other words, how can you become more yourself while still being a loving parent or a partner or child? Striking that balance of self and others is a journey, but there are practical steps to get started. One of the first steps when I'm working with a client is to cultivate self-awareness and start to move towards a solid sense of self. For some therapists, they're working with individuals, their clients are individuals who already have a pretty solid sense of self. Maybe they've encountered a rough patch, or they just went through something that brings them into therapy, or maybe they're wanting to develop something more. But they already have a solid foundation on board. These are not typically the clients that I'm working with. So usually step one starts with self-awareness. And that also includes self-awareness of how they developed who they are and whether that's working for them or not. And starting to progress toward this solid sense of self is going to take some time. I think it's really important to start by getting to know your own thoughts, feelings, and values. Sometimes I work with clients and I would say they're more in that stage where they're looking at rules and this is what's true. They're still in that black and white perspective. And that's fine. But I might ask them, why don't you make a list of those truths that guide your life? I'm trying to move that into a guiding principle and starting to connect them to their values. Instead of looking at rules that somebody else created or truth that has been given to them, let's make this personal. Let's look at this for you. What can you distill from this? I'll say to them, oftentimes we find that when we're pursuing truth, there might be some big T truths, like the law of gravity, for example. You don't have to believe in the law of gravity, but if you throw something up, it might come down and hit you on the head. So it's best to move out of the way. That big T truth, it's true regardless of whether you believe it or not. It's just true. Other times we're dealing with small T truths, things that are true for me. Maybe not 100% of the time, but more often than not. And when I come across those expectations, I've made an allowance for that. Now, this might sound obvious, but it is easy for people to go on autopilot, automatically adapting their opinions or their desires of those around them, their parents, their family, their church, their community. So we need to make this intentional. We need to create some time to reflect about, what do I really think? What is my life experience taught me? How do I feel in this particular situation? This process can help us start to tune into our own inner voice. Psychologists will talk about developing a solid sense of self. And I've talked about that in a lot of different episodes, which means that you know who you are and what you believe in, independently of external approval. For example, if you realize that you truly love jazz music, even if your friends hate it, you honor that knowledge. And maybe you also find people who love jazz music. A solid self is flexible. It can be adaptable. You can hear others' viewpoints, but you're not automatically swayed. Practicing mindfulness and meditation can also strengthen individual ability to stay centered in your own experience. The goal is to reach a point where you know your worth and your truth, regardless of the feedback that you get from others. I would say that's one of the first things to start working towards. Another thing that's important to keep in mind is this process is going to require that you set boundaries. Sometimes we start with small ones. If you're used to always pleasing others, a small boundary would be to start asserting your needs. Sometimes we have to actually identify what those needs are or what those preferences are. But this could be as simple as telling a friend, actually, I can't meet on Tuesday. I need a night to myself. Or just saying, actually, I can't make it work on Tuesday. Can we make it work on Thursday? It could also be, in this day and age of connection on demand, is what I call it, with texting and cell phone usage, it might look like not answering a non-urgent phone call during times that you've set aside for your family or for you or for work. Setting boundaries helps us start to practice when to say no, which is really important to develop. And also when we truly say yes. And sometimes that can be a real struggle because we grew up with these ideas of boundaries that in our family, those boundaries weren't necessarily accepted. You can't ignore your mom's phone call. That's rude. That's hurtful. She might get mad. And mom's feelings will be hurt. And you would be in the wrong for doing that. Even if it was for a good reason, it doesn't matter. So you might need to start looking at that differently and start to think for yourself, what do I think about this? How can I include what mom wants? You might say, hey, mom, it's not about being rude. I'm not trying to respect you. I'm at work and I'm unavailable. Or I'm only available for crises. I am available at these times. Setting boundaries will usually feel uncomfortable at first. The guilt usually comes up, the feeling of letting others down, which is why it's important to start small and start to see that loved ones can respect this, depending on how they want to interpret it. Their interpretation isn't necessarily true or right. It's just their interpretation. They could interpret it differently, and that may start with you interpreting it differently and reminding yourself that you have a right to your time. You have a right to your energy. It isn't about being bad or being selfish. It's about setting reasonable limits that allow you to protect your relationships from hidden resentments down the line or a lack of transparency down the line. I think it's also important to embrace honest communication. Differentiation doesn't mean just silently doing your own thing. It also involves communicating openly with those that you love about who you are and how you work. And this can be challenging if you've been hiding your opinions or your needs. And instead, you've just been going along to get along on the surface while doing something else that's hidden. It might start with a small expression of your feelings or your thoughts on a matter. Gently, but truthfully. For example, instead of pretending that you're okay with a plan, that you actually really don't like, and just thinking to yourself, I'll just go along with this. And when the day comes, I'll cancel or I'll say I'm sick. I think a lot of people do that. But instead, you might say, hey, I know this is really important to you, but I feel uncomfortable about this part. Or I know you put a lot of planning into this, but I'm not able to do this part. Use I statements so that you're owning your perspective without blaming, without making it seem like they were wrong. You're not going to say something like, I can't believe you would put this in the plan or the agenda. But it's also important that you let them know that you have a right for not wanting to do that. And you'll own that. It will feel vulnerable, but it is a way of letting people see the real you. And the payoff is that you have more genuine relationships. The people in your life actually get to know you, not just this mirror of themselves. Oftentimes, you might be surprised and find that they respect you more because they know who you are. And even if they have different opinions, that's okay. We can tolerate a loved one's disappointment or disagreement. It might be a muscle that will need to be built in order to develop differentiation. But you will usually learn that the relationship can handle some differences. If you think about it, the strongest relationships out there do not just allow, but require each person to be their own individual, distinct self. I've worked with a lot of couples who came together and their initial connection was over sameness. And at a certain ages, yeah, we are valuing sameness. That's who we know. That's who we hang out with. How we get to know people. We're in the same group. We go to the same church. We have the same beliefs. We believe the same. We talk the same. We sound the same. And so we get into a relationship. But as we start to mature and differentiation continues to develop, the sameness may not stay. Really, the sameness shouldn't stay. But that can feel threatening to the relationship. Sometimes it is technically threatening to how the relationship started because it is changing. It's evolving. It's not going to be what it was. It's not necessarily a threat to the relationship. If the other person can't adapt, it might be, but it isn't a guarantee that it is. Which takes us to another step that's important, and that is to start practicing, as we're navigating differentiation, how to manage reactivity. It's important to stay calm and grounded. A big part of differentiation is emotional self-regulation. When conflicts or differences arise, notice that maybe there is some anxiety or there's some anger. Instead of just reacting to that emotion in the heat of the moment, or surrendering your position out of fear or blowing up in defense of your situation, you take a breather. Whether that's taking a deep breath, counting to 10, or taking a short break and being able to regulate yourself and then come back. The idea is to remain present and engaged without melting down and without shutting down. So again, this might involve practicing mindfulness, having some mantras on board, reminding yourself that their emotions are their emotions. Their emotions aren't necessarily a threat to you. You don't have to absorb them. You don't have to fix them. You don't have to manage them. And you don't have to agree with them. Now, if this is your partner, you have to show up as their partner. If this is a friend, you need to show up as a friend once you're emotionally regulated. When we can emotionally regulate, we can hear the other person better and also stay true to what we need to say. It's really hard to be yourself if you're emotionally flooded or if you're in panic and anxiety mode about someone being angry or somebody disagreeing with you or being hurt by you. So practice and build your self-soothing abilities. You might have to develop a mantra like, I can handle hard things. I can handle differences. Differences are a way of connecting. Differences are a different way of connecting. Over time, these skills that you practice can help you remain calm. It might help others start to emotionally regulate, which leads to more constructive exchanges instead of screaming matches or silent treatment and ghosting. Also, differentiation is not about turning cold or indifferent to others. It's about integrating your needs with others. Continue to practice empathy and concern for your loved ones, while also advocating an equal place for yourself. In any healthy relationship, whether that's a marriage, a friendship, or a parent-child relationship, there should be room for two whole people. Both of you matter. When faced with decisions or conflicts, try to find outcomes that honor and address both parties' needs. This might mean creative compromises or simply taking turns. Often, I have found when I've worked with couples or a parent-child dynamic, getting curious and asking for more context around the situation. Tell me why this is so important to you. Tell me what you're hearing me say. Tell me what you think that means. Usually, we can find our way through when we understand the individual core needs or core fears or dreams or desires or wants that are coming up in that situation. This is essentially being able to practice what Carol Gilligan called the integrated care perspective in everyday life. Nobody's well-being, including your own, should be ignored. And it helps to remind ourselves that, especially if you're a natural people pleaser, your happiness and health are just as important as anyone else's. We do have research, in fact, that consistently ignoring your own needs can backfire and harm the relationship and even harm your physical health in the long run. So balance isn't just about being selfish. It allows for this. If you've come from a place of people pleasing, being prioritized, self-sacrificing, it's going to be important to spend time practicing saying yes to yourself. Now, this phrase might strike a chord if you tend to always say yes to others. Saying yes to yourself means giving yourself permission to do what nourishes you, even if that might mean saying no to someone. When my kids were younger, I remember going through a year, and back then, like, I've never loved New Year's resolutions, but I did like the idea of marking the new year some way. And so back then, I would pick a word in January that I wanted to be a guiding principle or a guiding theme for that year. So I would pick a word in January that was inspiring to me or that I felt like I needed to be reminded of. Now, sometimes in May or July, I found, oftentimes actually, I found that I had to update that word. And usually that was recognizing partway through the year. Actually, I think this year is taking on a life of its own because that's how it works. And sometimes I would laugh to myself and be like, oh, that's really funny that you thought it was going to be this word. And what's actually turning out in the year, in this particular year, is about this word instead. Maybe the exact opposite of the word that I had picked. So there was this year when my kids were, maybe my oldest were reaching close to the middle school years. And I don't remember what word I had picked in January, but what the year turned out to be, it was a year of me being able to practice and having to say no to things. No to others, no to obligations, no to expectations. That year, it seemed like that was a year of me learning to say no. Now, looking back, this seems kind of obvious to me, but at the time it was surprising. because the next year I picked whatever word I thought would be good to follow. And it wasn't that word. The next year, I found, again, maybe halfway through the year, that actually what this year was requiring of me was saying yes, internal yes. Which, yeah, looking back, I'm like, duh, how did I not see that coming? That a year of learning to say no would be followed by a year of me saying yes about things that I wanted to do. And I do think that having a year where I was verbalizing and saying no to things actually cleared some space for me to say yes to the things that really mattered. And a lot of the things that I said yes to scared me. I could come up with a whole list of reasons why no was the answer. And I remember during that year even wondering, maybe I shouldn't have been practicing no for a whole year. Maybe saying no, learning to say no wasn't what was required. Maybe I went too far with it. But then I remembered going through the events from that previous year. And I think those were things that I needed to say no to. Looking back, I think I said no to the right things. And then it kind of hit me, oh, that was clearing the way for me to actually say yes to things. And I found that actually saying yes was harder than saying no. Saying no wasn't easy, but saying yes was a little bit more difficult. It felt more vulnerable. It felt scary because it was opening up to possibilities. Some that I had stopped dreaming of, that I had never considered. Sometimes an opportunity would present itself, and I would just automatically shut that down and be like, oh, I can't do that. And then I found myself slowly coming to a yes. A few of those times I checked in with my husband. I'd check in with my kids. I'd say, look, here's this opportunity that I was offered, and it will impact our family. Maybe not in a good way. I won't be around as much. It's going to take my time. It might be hard. And one of the times we were having a family meeting, and I was talking about that. And I'd already talked to my husband. I knew what he was thinking. His answer when I had approached him about it, he just said, we can make it work. But in this particular meeting, the kids are present. He didn't really say much of anything until the end. But I was laying it out, convinced that they were going to agree with my no. And actually, one by one, they all said, so why can't you do it? One of them said, well, I think you should say yes. Absolutely, you should say yes. This is a great opportunity for you. And after all four had given their opinions, I looked at my husband and he said, I think it's a yes. And that was hard for me. That was scary for me. I was used to the no's. I grew up being told no a lot. You can't do that. No, you can't have that. No, we don't have money for that. No, that's wrong. So actually for me, practicing the yeses was a bigger stretch. I do also think it was important that it came after a year of intentionally and with self-awareness saying no. I learned from that year that when I honored my own needs and my values, which, I had long ago lost track of, I was starting this process of affirming that I mattered. I mattered to me. Now, paradoxically, that made me genuinely more available in the present when I was saying yes. I was giving from a place of authenticity and fullness, not out of obligation or staying small. Changing lifelong patterns of relating can be hard, and it's okay to get help. Seeking professional help from a therapist who works with family systems or relational therapy, those would be some things. If you're wanting to work with a professional on differentiation, those would be some things you're looking for in their bios. Sometimes that might involve bringing your partner in so that they can understand what you're trying to do and they're not feeling threatened by the changes that are happening. It's important to remember that differentiation is a gradual process. We don't just automatically flip a switch overnight. And it might cause some friction as others and you adjust to the new you, who might not be quite as people-pleasing or self-sacrificing or acquiescent as before. Stay the course and be kind and firm. Over time, the relationships that can support you in differentiation will find a new equilibrium. And for the other relationships that can accept this differentiated self, you'll find that they might fade. They might self-select out, which, difficult as it might be, may actually be for the best and allow for more genuine connections to come into your life. So I'm going to wrap up here. I will say a few things for those of you who are not Patreon members. If you want to become a Patreon member, you can head over to Patreon, look for Thanks for Sharing, all one word, and you'll see my face. You'll see something similar to the podcast thumbnail, and you can sign up and become a member. For those of you who at this time can't, for whatever reason, become a member of Patreon, I want to spend a few minutes talking about false differentiation. As I said, the process of differentiation is difficult. It's usually an uncomfortable process of growth and change. And I want to repeat that a well-differentiated individual can think clearly under pressure. In those moments, they can make choices based on their personal values, how they see themselves, without reflexively conforming or automatically rebelling against those around them. And false differentiation is also a thing. I've discussed this sense of self in different episodes, which you may have heard me talk about if you've been a long-time listener. But it is distressing not to have a solid enough sense of self in place. And so if that's the case, if we don't have this solid enough sense of self, we are going to look for substitutes for this genuine, authentic sense of self that hasn't been developed. False differentiation describes this pseudo-independence when someone believes they're asserting individuality, but in reality, their identity is defined by their group or by opposition to another group. Pseudo-independence is usually an extreme reaction against dependence rather than true independence. Simply doing the opposite of what others expect is not genuine autonomy. I saw this a lot when I worked with court-ordered teens. This was the first job I had out of grad school, was working with teens who were court-ordered for substance abuse. And getting to know their families, if that was an option, getting to know the teen themselves, which is where some of that differentiation is really starting to butt heads. And they're belonging to their family, but they're starting to try this process of trying to belong to themselves. And usually that's going to look different than what the parents imagined or what they're comfortable with. These were teens who were court-ordered for treatment. So those were the clients I was working with and family systems that I was working with. And it was really interesting working with these teens. I was like 25 years old. So I was still coming into my own sense of self. But it seemed obvious to me. It was not obvious to them, but it seemed obvious to me that this rebellious state was not this genuine, this is me. It wasn't this exclamation of who I am. It was simply more of an F you. I'm not you. And so if I could get to the point in my relationship with that client, I would point that out. I might also point that out to the parent. I would want to know if the teen could see it and talk about what's in the middle here. Because sure, maybe your parents are at this extreme, but you're going to this extreme just as an act of rebellion. That's not really a claiming of who you are. That's just saying, I'm not this. This isn't even being addressed, this middle ground of who am I? They want you to be this. You're saying, hell no. But now what? Where are we going to go from here? Nothing's actually being built. Nothing is actually being explored in a healthy way that's going to lead you to a foundation of self. It's just another form of being controlled by other. Your parents want you to do this. And instead of it genuinely exploring what you want to do or who you are, you're just going to the opposite. As extreme as you can, you're doing the opposite, which is still putting the initial motivation with parents. And again, teens are not the only ones who do this. Bowen's theory of family systems noted that an extreme rebel is a poorly differentiated person as well. But they pretend to be a self by routinely opposing the positions of others. That's not care orientation that we've talked about here. How I determine right, wrong, the laws, the relationships I'm part of, what feels morally right, what's legally right. They're not going through that process. They're just pretending to be a self by opposing the positions of others, who they are not. I'm going to talk about this more on Patreon. So for those of you who are a Patreon member, head over to Patreon. For those of you who have listened, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope this episode has been interesting, has got you thinking of some things that you need to start for yourself, or maybe it's validating a process that you have already started. At the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. Remember, there's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie. For those of you who have joined me over here on Patreon, I appreciate your membership, and I appreciate you hopping on to continue this conversation, particularly of false differentiation. We see this dynamic frequently. And we're seeing it, I think, more. Some of the things that are happening remind me of things that were happening when I was young. I was born in 1970. So there were political assassinations. There was a lot of differences, protests happening. There was a lot of corruption. There was corruption in the government. There were a lot of cults in the 70s. I think we're experiencing another high for cults, maybe different types of cults than what were there in the 70s, but still cultish. And there were a lot of government standoffs with extremist organizations. I think all of these are examples of false differentiation in the realm of political and religious identity. Individuals, including public figures, can loudly claim that they're free thinkers, or that they're Christians, or that they've broken from the crowd, when in reality, they've just really aligned with a different crowd, or they took a different stance because it's the polar opposite of their rivals. Sometimes it's just a reorganizing, which is a first order change, as I talked about in a recent podcast episode. I'm still following the rules of the group. I just switched which groups are telling me what to do. I have a cousin. She's closer to my kid's age than she is to mine. In my extended family, I'm one of, I think it's 27 grandchildren with the grandparents on my mom's side. On my dad's side, there's 9, and 6 of them are my family. So we had 3 cousins. But on my mom's side, there's 27 grandchildren. And there's a big difference in our age. She would be out of 27, she would be number 21, maybe 23. I don't remember some of their ages, but that's a big difference in our ages. It's almost a whole generation. So of course I had kids who were closer to her age than I was. I think my youngest cousin is 1 year older than my oldest daughter. There were also 6 kids in my mom's family. And as my kids were growing up, they knew this cousin. we'd get together at family things and she'd show an interest in my kids. I think she was interested because she didn't have any sisters and my kids only had sisters. She only had brothers. And so I think she was somewhat intrigued by the dynamic of an all-girl family and their development in this all-girl family. And when she was a young adult, late teens, early 20s, she was very involved in the religion that my whole family was born into, grew up in. And it was something that came into most of our conversations with her particularly, which isn't exactly how I raised my kids, even though I was raising them in the same religion. So when she would be talking to my kids, those conversations about religion would come up. And she'd be teaching them or talking to them, but more like preaching to them, which, later they would talk to me about. They kind of away from that. That didn't feel connecting to them. They didn't like being preached at. And when my cousin was maybe 23, 24, she went through a faith deconstruction and left the religion that our whole extended family was raised in. And it was interesting because as she deconstructed the religion, I think because of my family system growing up, well, I would say she did not have a healthy family system growing up either. But I think my family system created a different impact on me that always had me questioning, because I knew that my family of origin did not fit with what our Christian religion was teaching. I knew that my family didn't fit that model. So I was always looking for what's plan B, what's plan C? What does it look like if it's not according to this plan? What's the backup plan? Where am I in this plan? Because I was never in plan A, right? But I don't gather that's what she did. She left organized religion and she became a vegan. And nothing wrong with vegans. But when we would get together, she would be preaching veganism. And, we would be around each other. My kids later would be like, she's so difficult to be around. So one of the things the women in my family and my mom's family side of the family we'd usually do it in October because there were school teachers. So the women who were working, my mom and the sister right under her, were school teachers. The other two sisters didn't necessarily work, and one of their brothers lived out of state. The other brother had a stay-at-home wife, although he was a school teacher too. And so there's a fall break with schools in October. And historically, we started doing lunch together at that point. And then that continued with my generation. It actually started with my mom's generation. And then that continued with my mom's family and the girls. So any of the nieces or cousins who were girls. And we would see her every year at this fall lunch. And one of the years she ended up coming late and she ended up taking a seat by me. And so I got the experience. Instead of hearing about it from my kids, I got the experience firsthand. And as I'm eating, the waitress comes over to see if she wants to order anything since she's late. And she says, no, thank you. And then she proceeds to tell me why she doesn't eat from restaurants because she can't guarantee cruelty to animals. And my order comes and I'm starting to eat. She's pointing out all these things with my lunch. And I usually eat fairly healthy, but I don't go to the extremes that she was going to. And I don't drink a lot of soda, so I had just gotten water. But she's even being critical of the water, like, oh, you don't know. Like, they had asked her if she wanted water. She said no, because you don't know where this water ended up. It was just such an unpleasant lunch experience. And my kids commented, I was telling them on the drive home about my experience, and my kids said, yeah, it's a lot like when she was religious, except now her religion is being vegan, but she still preaches to everybody. And it's all she can talk about, which they were not wrong. So last summer, the summer of 2024, was the first time in years, probably the first time ever, that I hosted a barbecue. So I invited that cousin, her dad, and his kids. In that particular family situation, that's a whole other long story. My aunt is the one I'm related to. Their mom is my mom's younger sister. But that particular aunt, I would say I was close to her. This uncle lived across the street from my grandparents. His family lived across the street from my grandparents. And like high school, and he was one of my uncle's friends. And so, being the second grandchild of 27, I was around then. And I feel like he is in my memories almost as far back as they go. So, yes, technically, he was only my uncle by marriage, and they divorced. They started having issues my senior year, and they started divorcing when I was away at college, my first year after I graduated high school and was away at college. And my aunt would drag me into some things. Anyway, it's this whole other story that I'm not going to go into. My aunt cut off contact with the entire family for 10, 15 years, something like that. Would not have contact with my mom, with nobody. This was the aunt. I might have said this. So this was the aunt. I was engaged. My two youngest aunts, my mom's two younger sisters, were 10 and 12 years older than me. And I remember going on dates with them. I remember going to high school functions. I loved hanging out with those two aunts, and I was close to them. Before this aunt got divorced, if her husband was out of town for work, she would have me come sleep over. A lot of times he would take her out of town with him, and then I would be in charge of the kids. So I spend a lot of time in their home. And she gets divorced. We don't really have much contact. She starts coming around a little bit more, having more interaction with her sisters. At first, I think it was just her sisters. And so I get engaged to be married, and she contacts me and asks, where are you guys going to live? And I said, oh, we have an apartment. And she said, can I see it? And I think she was trying to be a good aunt and interested in what I was doing. So I told her the address of the apartment, and I met her at the apartment. So it was just my aunt and I at the apartment. And so I give her a tour of the apartment. So we had like a year from the time we got married before we moved away so that I could go to grad school. And I graduated with my bachelor's. My husband was my fiance at the time, but we were looking for that year, saving up for me to go to grad school. And my aunt came to see the apartment that we were going to live in, and I give her a tour. She's like, this is a pretty nice apartment. She asked how much it costs a month. She's like, that's really great. And then she says to me, I'm really disappointed that you decided to get married and throw your whole life away. And I just looked at her. I didn't know what to say. It wasn't surprising because of the preceding years and how much she had changed. But I just looked at her. She didn't know that I was going to be going to grad school. There was some projection from her onto me. I definitely know that. And I said to her, I'm not giving up my life. And she just smiled and said, yeah, that's what every woman thinks. I didn't know what to say. It was just so that was that aunt. Also, when she started coming around, she wasn't really that easy to be around, because she would say things like that when there's no other witnesses. If she was there with my other aunt would have been like, that's rude. Why are you saying that? That's not necessary. She doesn't have to give up her whole life because she gets married. So back to the summer of 2024. I invited her ex. I still call him my uncle. Technically, I guess he's not my uncle because they're divorced. But I invited him. This is the uncle I've talked about before who had a faith deconstruction, and approached me at my daughter's wedding in 2022 and asked if we could talk. And he knew that we had deconstructed. Also, his wife passed away the December before, on the same day of my mom's death date. Anyways, we got together Some of his kids came. Some of his sons, I hadn't really seen. One son, I think I had only seen him once since he and I were both adults. He had a long history of drug addiction and never came to family things. And so I saw him one time, maybe in 2018 or 2019. And he would get stretches of sobriety, a couple of months. His main drug he was using was heroin. And so he had recently had a relapse. And we talked, we had a good conversation. But as we left, I said to my husband, like, we may never see him again, like ever. And so he came to the barbecue that I hosted last summer. It was great seeing them. This one cousin was 10 months sober, which is the longest stretch of sobriety he has had. I believe he is still sober, but I am hosting another barbecue with them this Saturday. So I will find out. So anyway, back to the barbecue in 2024. I texted my cousin and I was just asking what she's eating. What can I make that she'll eat? Is she bringing her own food? And I was surprised to learn that she totally eats meat, that wasn't even a problem. She didn't even acknowledge why I would be asking that. She just answered like, of course I eat meat. She is a little picky where she'll buy meat from, but frankly, so am I. And so she was fine with where I was buying it from, which was a local butcher. And I do think that's an example of one of the things we can substitute our identity for something besides an actual sense of self. I think religion can serve as a substitution for self, which helps us bypass the discomfort of not having a full, authentic sense of self on board. Recently, I would say maybe in the past decade, we're also seeing people. I don't know if this is connected to research saying that more people are leaving religion, leaving organized religion. So I don't know if this is part of that, because I also know that Republican or conservative politics have very much become part and parcel with Christian politics, not really conservative politics the way they used to be. But I have wondered if, with many people leaving organized religion, if one of the things that they used to substitute for a sense of self was their religion, and now they're putting in politics in place of that sense of self, which neither of these work functionally when they are serving as a substitute for a solid sense of self. I think both of these things, your religious identity and your political identity, should be an expression of who you are as a person, not as a substitute for that sense of self, for the authentic self. And I think we're seeing the results of that. More and more in this second Trump administration, we are seeing that in this country, we have a problem with Christianity. And I know there's some people who are, I think the term is Christian light. This is not what they believe. They are loving, they are inclusive, they are accepting, they're trying to follow the New Testament Jesus. But I don't think we can deny that the way Christian nationalism has entered the stage and mixed itself with politics is not problematic. And so we see people who proclaim their religion, but they've weaponized it. And it doesn't seem that they feel any internal cognitive dissonance between claiming to be a Christian and then voting for things that they know will hurt people, will hurt the marginalized people in this country, and benefit the very wealthy. I mean, I've read the Bible. That is not what Jesus was teaching. Those are not the people that Jesus was praising, the very wealthy, the very knowledgeable, people who had power. When we're talking about false differentiation, We can very quickly go to extremes with false differentiation. Many current right-wing activists and commentators pride themselves on being politically incorrect. They are these rebellious truth tellers who refuse to bow to what they're saying is woke political correctness or woke ideology. On the surface, to them, this might look like fierce independence. But in reality, the idea of owning the libs has become a group rallying cry or a scripted performance of defiance that adheres to its own very strict in-group norms. One of the things that I found interesting when it comes to what's going on politically right now is that as sociologists started looking at conspiracy theories that became so prevalent under Donald Trump's first administration, they started to see that the less mainstream or the less people believed, the less number of people who believed something, true believers actually held on to it even more. There was this idea that I'm more special or I'm more informed because other people reject this truth. Mainstream rejects this truth when I see it as truth. And we saw this misinformation, disinformation, but also this belief, this strong belief, lead to tragic real-world examples like January 6th and the Capitol riot. Many participants genuinely thought of themselves as brave patriots, acting on their own convictions. They wrapped themselves in revolutionary rhetoric, likening themselves to 1776 freedom fighters. And they assumed they were operating on this belief that they were heroically defying a corrupt system. Now, as we know, surveys later showed that a huge driver of the riot was group loyalty to President Donald Trump and this shared belief in his stolen election lie. So in other words, these so-called independent patriots were overwhelmingly standing up for Trump, following this one man's baseless narrative, along with a mob of others. This one man who can't even blend his makeup. They see him as the strong man when he is anything but. Following the January 6th riot, Speaker Kevin McCarthy state that impeachment of Donald Trump wasn't fast enough, that they needed to apply the 25th Amendment. But we all know that didn't last very long. Mitch McConnell said he was one of the most corrupt individuals ever, which I think Mitch McConnell is very corrupt and serves his own self-interest. But for him to talk about Donald Trump in this negative way, but not something that you see broadcast predominantly. And he's not still beating that drum. He's still going along with Donald Trump. He endorsed him for the 2024 election. Some of the political leaders on the far right acknowledge at times that they know who Donald Trump is. They're aware of what's going on, but they don't do anything about that. They're just obeying this different authority, and anything they can do to demonize the left, they will do. We also saw false differentiation play out in anti-mask and anti-vaccine movements during COVID-19. Individuals would claim that they weren't blindly following the crowd who wore masks or got vaccinated. They fancied themselves fearless, independent thinkers, resisting this supposed herd mentality. But many were actually, in fact, aligning very tightly with this alternative crowd. One that had its own leaders, its own media ecosystem, and social media groupthink. They all echoed the same talking points. This virus is a hoax, masks are tyranny, and they attended each other's rallies and ostracized anyone in their ranks who dissented. Their choices were less about carefully weighed personal risk tolerance and more about signaling loyalty to a tribe. That can be a lot more dangerous than rebellious teenagers. Political affiliation isn't the only sphere where this phenomenon occurs. Religious identity and shifts in a person's belief can also involve false differentiation. So a classic scenario, like I talked about, the rebellious youth who breaks away from their family's faith tradition, proclaiming they're forging their own spiritual path, when in reality, their choices are really about defying their parents and this religious institution or this religious voice, rather than pursuing their own genuine spiritual convictions. On the surface, they might be differentiating themselves. But if their new identity is essentially anything that this religion said no to, or anything that my parents hate, then the parents are still unwittingly controlling the person's choice. They haven't actually developed an independent self and are just locked in this reactive stance. Therapists will often warn that when someone leaves a strict or neglectful upbringing, they are prone to adopting pseudo-independence, which is just doing the opposite of what their family or their religious group did as a reaction, rather than healing and discovering their true sense of self. The motivation is often still tied to the original group. Now, you may be saying, well, I identify as a Christian and I'm not that way. Then I'm not talking to you. Some people also might be wondering, well, what am I going to say about the left? Am I only going to pick on the right? Right now, today, yes, I'm only calling out the right, because right now in America, only one political party is endangering democracy and is endangering the lives of individuals who aren't what they consider Americans just because of their country of origin or their race. I will also say, however, and I'm not in the Christian circles, and so maybe these conversations are happening. From time to time, I see some YouTube where a pastor speaks to what's happening currently in America and calls it out and says, this is not Jesus. So I know that's happening, but I'm not seeing it on a large scale. I think often when the problems arise, the people who are the insiders, maybe former Republicans like Mitt Romney from my state, really can have a voice. I know what happened to Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney. Liz Cheney voted a high percentage with Donald Trump's policies in the first administration. But we don't see a lot of insiders or on the Christian side start to call out and say, this is not Christianity. I'm sorry, MAGA Mike Johnson, this is not Christianity. And start to question who he is proclaiming to follow. Because it seems pretty clear to me that he's following the narcissistic psychopath leading our country and not Jesus. As Bowen describes, a differentiated self can reject others' views without polarizing the differences and support others' views without becoming a disciple. In contrast, the falsely differentiated individual is enmeshed in polarization. Isn't that a good description? They're enmeshed in polarization. They either merge with their in-group's mentality or they take a knee-jerk opposite stance to another group. Their actions are interdependent with the very people they claim not to follow. And these patterns are going to fail to foster authentic personal growth because the person isn't truly discovering and developing their own internal identity. Instead, they're doing a superficial inversion of someone else's. I read the book years ago, probably 10 years ago, maybe 12, something like that. I read the book, The Sociopath Next Door. And in that book, the author was saying about 25% of the population are sociopaths. Just for reference sake, we usually lump all of these sociopaths, psychopaths, antisocial personality disorder, we lump them all together. And so she was saying percent of the population, this occurs. I don't think I was aware that one in four, that's a lot of sociopaths. And then Donald Trump got elected. And I was like, oh, yeah, a lot of the people he brought with him and who surrounded him, I didn't know. I'd never heard these people. But I was like, oh, yeah, okay, those are all sociopaths that I wasn't aware of, or psychopaths that I wasn't aware of. And then this administration, some of the same, others new. I'm like, okay, yeah, I'm believing that statistic in the book. This is a lot of sociopaths and psychopaths out there. And apparently they hang out a lot with Donald Trump, or Donald Trump knows them. I don't know them, but he knows them. And I'm not saying that everybody who is around him is a psychopath, but when you are following a psychopath, the psychopath sets the rules. The psychopath defines the culture. The psychopath defines what's in and what's out, what's okay to say and what's not okay to say. And we are in a very dangerous territory because of individuals who have not been able to differentiate in healthy ways and substitute a false sense of self for differentiation. Unfortunately, false differentiation keeps an individual stuck in a defensive posture. They're often haunted by the very influence they're running from. And I will say that false differentiation poisons the well of meaningful dialogue. When people are operating from a stance of automatic opposition or in-group allegiance, genuine communication breaks down. Constructive dialogue requires open-mindedness, empathy, and curiosity. These are qualities that allow a person to listen and even update or adjust their views in light of new information. The pseudo-independent stance is inherently closed-minded. It says, I've already made my mind up that your side is wrong and that my side is right. And they're not really listening except to find ammunition to shut you down. Encounters between two falsely differentiated opponents devolves into what we see so much in our society today, whether that's online or in person, where we're talking past each other, we're trading slogans or one-upmanship rather than having an honest exchange. False differentiation stifles growth. And the result is often nobody truly learns from somebody who's different. This fear of group disapproval will keep people in lockstep, reinforcing echo chambers and polarization. And the result is often that nobody truly learns from somebody who's different. And the individuals who are involved don't evolve their thinking. So while false differentiation might be alluring, because it does allow us to bypass the distress of not having an authentic sense of self, it's a seductive dead end. It offers the appearance of strength and individuality, but it delivers little substance. People who fall into this trap often end up conforming by rebelling, as paradoxical as that might sound. They miss the opportunity to cultivate a more nuanced principle of self that isn't just this byproduct of group dynamic. And then the last area I want to discuss with false differentiation is looking for a relationship. I'll see this with clients when they're starting to deconstruct who they're not. Sometimes that's an easier place to start with, exploring the sense of self, to begin to explore who I am not. It's not going to get us all the way there, but it can be a safe and effective starting point if we won't go into extremes. I see for some of my clients, they're single, they start dating, they may not have a solid enough sense of self developed in order to go into vulnerable situations like dating, being attracted to somebody, hoping somebody's attracted to them, and getting to know each other. And often that yearning to be accepted for who you are starts to be fulfilled by this person, which shifts it from an internal desire to be accepted for who I am as a person, being accepted and respected, and it starts to shift to wanting to be accepted by you. And then the person will begin to do what the other thinks is right, or what they want or need you to be. And now we've shifted from starting from this internal place and shifting it to the external and hoping that translates internally. And we know that's not going to work. Another person cannot love us enough to give us our sense of self. And they can certainly cause damage to the sense of self that is starting to develop. Nobody can tell us who we are. So I wrap up here with differentiation theory and the concept of individuation. They both teach us the value of becoming a distinct self. Moral development theory, such as Kohlberg's and Gilligan's, shows us that maturity involves a nuanced balance between self and others. I've discussed how Kohlberg emphasized the development of an independent moral conscience and the application of universal principles, and how Gilligan highlighted the importance of relationships and caring, ultimately advocating for a balance where one's own needs and others' needs are both respected. This mirrors what we strive for in differentiation, not losing ourselves in others, yet not ignoring them completely, and engaging in relationships as authentic individuals. For you right now, walking the path of differentiation might mean some daily small victories, such as voicing a different opinion, envisioning a different path for your life, or discovering that your friend still likes you when you say no. It might be envisioning a life that's different than the one that was set out for you, whether that was through trauma or parents' hopes and dreams for you. It has to align with who you are and what you want for yourself. Sometimes I will have clients ask, what's wrong with being who my parents want me to be? I think this question assumes there's only one way you as an individual can be. And it bypasses the discovery process of you determining who you are, of you knowing that this is who I am, not who my parents want me to be. Each time you assert your true self with kindness, you're strengthening that individuation muscle. You're proving to yourself that you can be independent and connected. It's a lifelong journey. Even Carl Jung saw individuation as a process that continues throughout life. And he said it's also a rewarding one. The more you become who you really are, the more meaning and purpose you'll likely feel. And the more your relationships will be based on genuine love and understanding, not fear, not facades. The goal is balance. Differentiation theory tells us when you stand as a self-defined person, you're actually in a better position to love and to listen, because you're not driven by anxiety or approval seeking. You're driven by your values, your guiding principles, and empathy. By balancing the needs and wants of yourself with those of the people you love, you're not just finding personal freedom, you will be creating healthier, more resilient relationships. And that's something that both you and your loved ones ultimately benefit from. And ultimately that our country will benefit from. I hope this episode has given you some food for thought, along with some practical insight and maybe where you got lost along the way. Remember, this is not an either or process. It's a both and. Until next time, remember that your story matters. There's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.